Well, as I said, this morning we come to the end of our time in the book of Ruth, but because we had a break last week for the Christmas journey and the carol service, and because there's one or two visitors with us today, before we dive in, let me remind you of the story so far. Our story is set in the time of the Judges, which was a dark time for the people of Israel, a time when there was no king among God's people, and so no one to show them how to live God's way, which meant everyone did as they saw fit. And that led God to send a famine on the land. It was meant to be a sort of warning light on the dashboard for God's people, to tell them to turn back to him. But for at least one family, the family in our story this morning, they didn't do that. Rather than turning back to God, they fled further from him. They left their home in Bethlehem to move to Moab, to a place where the famine hadn't hit. And while that move seemed really sensible on paper, actually it saw them running further away from the Lord, to a place where they were among the enemies of God's people, the Moabites. But went in search for food they did, and this land that promised so much life, so much hope, that promised food, tragically brought death to this family. The father, the two sons, they die in Moab, and they leave only Naomi and the two Moabite women that those sons married, her daughters-in-law, Ruth and Orpah. They spend 10 years in total in Moab. And after 10 years, Naomi, the mother, hears that the famine in Bethlehem is over. And so she returns home, accompanied by Ruth, one of those daughters-in-law. And these two destitute widows come back to Bethlehem at harvest time. And although the people of Israel are raking in the harvest because the famine is over, these two women have nothing to eat. And so to get something, Ruth goes out gleaning in one of the local fields. She follows the harvesters along, picking up the bits of grain that have been dropped to take home for her and Ruth. And it just so happened that she was doing that in the field of Boaz, a man who was incredibly, unusually generous in that generation of people who did as they saw fit. And he provided far more than Ruth and Naomi needed. But more than that, he just happened to be something called a guardian redeemer for Naomi's family. Now, let me explain what that means. In Old Testament times, for better or worse, your family's land was farmed by the men and passed down the male side of your family. And of course, that was a problem for Ruth and Naomi because, well, both their husbands are dead and none of them have any children, let alone any sons. But because God is kind and compassionate, he provided a solution for a situation like this, the guardian redeemer. This was a male relative, a single man who, in a situation like this, would marry the widowed woman. And if the Lord blessed them with children, their first son would farm not his land, but the dead man's land. And this ensured that there was both a son to care for the widow in her old age, and that family name, that family line would continue. Okay, that's the guardian redeemer. And when Naomi saw how generous Boaz was to Ruth, and knowing that he was one of these guardian redeemers, in their sort of desperation, they hatch a bold plan. And they decide that Ruth is going to propose to Boaz, asking him to redeem her, to save her, and indeed Naomi. And at the end of chapter 3, where we were a couple of weeks ago, Boaz said yes, that he was willing to do this. And we were sort of cheering and whooping. But then we heard him say that there was another man, a more closely related man, who had a greater responsibility to act in this way. And so at the end of chapter 3, we were left hanging, One of those really annoying moments that in that box set you're watching that just makes you click on and watch the next one to find out what will happen. Will Boaz be Ruth's guardian redeemer, or this other man step in? Well, let's dive in and see what happens. Verse 1 of Ruth, chapter 1. Naomi and Ruth are wondering what's going to happen. We read chapter 4, verse 1. Meanwhile, Boaz went to the town gate and sat down there, just as the other guardian redeemer he'd mentioned had come along. Boaz says, "Come over here, my friend, and sit down." So he went over and sat down. Boaz took 10 of the elders and said, "Sit here." And they did so. Then he said to the guardian redeemer, "Naomi, who has come back from Moab, is selling the piece of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. I thought I should bring the matter to your attention and suggest that you buy it in the presence of those seated here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, do so. But if you will not, tell me, so I will know. For no one has the right to do it except you, and I am next in line." Boaz heads out to the town gate. The town gate in his day, it was the place where you would go for legal decisions to be made. Think sort of courthouse and town hall merged into one. And in the place where legal decisions was made, he sat down. Again, in their day, sitting, it was the sort of the posture you adopted when those legal decisions were to be made. And we sort of have a similar thing in our day and age, don't we? We talk about courts sitting. So Boaz, he sits down because there's a legal decision to be made. And, look, this other guardian redeemer comes along. So Boaz summons him over and tells him to sit down because they've got legal business to do. He then draws in 10 of the town's elders, who are later described as witnesses, the sort of people you need for a legal decision to be made. And so here at the start of Ruth 4, we've got our two possible redeemers. We're at the town gate in the place of legal decision-making. We're sitting down in the posture of legal decision-making with those 10 town elders to be the witnesses, the people you need for legal decision-making. Everything is in place for proceedings to commence. So, bang, down comes the gavel. I've always wanted to do that. Thank you, Soleil. And court is in session. Boaz explains the situation with Naomi's land to this other guardian redeemer, that it's up for sale because presumably in the time that Naomi and her family were away in a famine, they're not just going to let land lie fallow. And so it looks like someone's moved in to that land, and as they sell it, the guardian redeemer's job is to sort of clear that person out and to start farming it for themselves. Boaz explains that situation to this guardian redeemer, and he says, second half of verse 4, "Yes, I will redeem it." And if you've been reading through the book of Ruth, if you've been with us over these weeks, you sort of go, "Oh no, that wasn't meant to happen. This is not the sort of plot twist that we were looking for." It's a sort of real kick in the teeth for us and those who've been rooting for Ruth and Boaz. But actually, for this man, it's a sensible business decision because, well, Naomi's land would likely generate extra income that would sort of be more than he would need to care for this elderly widow. And if Naomi's not around forever, then, well, the land becomes his and he expands what he has. And so it seems sensible for him to do that, and you can understand why. But then when everything seems lost, and I just wonder if Boaz sort of had this bit of information in his back pocket. What does he say, verse 5? I remember on that day, when you buy the land from Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite. it makes her sound a bit like a possession, doesn't it? But it's more, she becomes your responsibility in the sort of best possible way. It's a dignifying statement. You also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the dead woman's widow, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property. At this, the guardian redeemer said, then I cannot redeem it, because I might endanger my own estate. You redeem it yourself. I cannot do it. Yes! Maybe we will get our happy ever after in the end. Suddenly it's back on for Ruth and for Boaz. But when I got to this point earlier in the week, I found myself wondering, why have all this stuff here? After all, parchment is precious, and this guardian redeemer, he didn't need to be mentioned, did he? I mean, obviously it's here because it's what happened, but we didn't need to have this bit of detail, because actually this other guy, he's sort of ultimately inconsequential to our story, and we get a hint of that when he says, it might endanger my own estate. But we get that question more answered in just a moment. We'll come to think, why is he here? Why is he mentioned? What does he add to this telling of the story? But first, there's a bit more due process to navigate. Verse 7, now in earlier times in Israel, for the redemption and transfer of property to become final, one party took off his sandal and gave it to the other. This was the method of legalizing transactions in Israel. So the guardian redeemer said to Boaz, buy it yourself. And he removed his sandal. Has anyone ever done that when they're buying a house? Here you go. That's the deal. Well, for Boaz and this man, it did. We're in the place of legal decision-making, in the posture, sitting down, in the posture of legal decision-making, surrounded by those witnesses, the people necessary for legal decision-making. And I couldn't help myself. We sealed the deal with these sandals, the pump of legal decision-making. Our narrator, he wants us to know there's no turning back for Boaz. Which I guess begs the question, well, why would Boaz be tempted to do that? And it turns out that the answer to that question is actually the same answer to why we're told so much about this other guardian redeemer. And we hear a bit more in verse 9. Then Boaz announced to the elders and all the people, today you are witnesses that I have brought from Naomi all the property of Elimelech, Chilion, and Mahlon. I've also required Ruth the Moabite, Mahlon's widow, as my wife, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property, so that his name will not disappear from among his family or from his hometown. Today you are witnesses. Then the elders and all the people at the gate said, we are witnesses. This transaction is all about redeeming Naomi's land. But did you notice in what Boaz says, there's sort of passing reference made to that, but much more is said about Ruth. But actually, it's not really Ruth who is the focus. What Boaz says, it seems to focus on Elimelech, her dead father-in-law, and how his marriage to Ruth will secure the continuation of his name. And that sort of explains why this other guardian redeemer was so worried about his own estate being endangered. It's why he pulled out. You see, it draws our attention to how costly this redemption is. Because Boaz, he not only had to provide for Naomi, but also for Ruth, and also for any children who might come along. And if there are children, well, the land that belonged to Elimelech will be inherited by the firstborn. It'll no longer be Boaz's. So he's lost the extra land, but he still has to bear the cost of caring for all the others, for Naomi and Ruth and the children. There's a real risk to his estate in this redemption. He could end up losing it all. But with this shout from the elders and all the people of the gate of "We are witnesses," from those people of legal, the people needed for legal decision making, there's no going back. You see, Ruth's redemption, it could be costly for Boaz, but it is certain. It's guaranteed. And if you've been following through with us, you've been here while we've been looking at Ruth, you might be cheering in your hearts warmed that it's going to end well for Ruth. But that's not the only reason to enjoy this great story that we've been thinking about this book over the past few weeks. Because actually, if we've seen throughout this book, throughout Ruth's story, her story, it points forward to our story. And this week, it points forward to how we have a costly but certain redemption. In the New Testament, the Apostle Peter reminds us of this, and he writes these words in his first letter. Writing to Christians, he said, "It was not with perishable things, such as silver or gold, that you were redeemed from the empty way of life handed down to you from your ancestors, but with the precious blood of Christ." Peter reminds us that it cost Jesus his life to redeem us from our empty way of life, from that life of having no hope, not knowing God in this world. Something far more costly than silver or gold. As we saw in Revelation, something that makes him worthy of honour and wealth and praise and glory. Our redemption, it's costly. It cost Jesus his life. But it's also certain, as Paul, another one of the New Testament writers, puts it in his letter to the Galatians. Writing of Jesus, he said, "God sent his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those under the law, that we might receive adoption to sonship, to be the legal heirs of all that Jesus has." You see, just as Boaz ensured that all due process was followed, even down to the pumps of legal decision-making, so God did just the same when he sent his Son into the world. Everything was done as it should be done. Everything was done according to his law. Our redemption, it was costly. Yes, it cost Jesus his life, but it's absolutely certain. It's guaranteed. There's nothing we can do to put it in jeopardy. There's no change in circumstance that might lead to Jesus having second thoughts. He's not going to take it to the appeal court and say, "Can I get out of this?" Brothers and sisters, our eternal future, it's secure because of the costly but certain redemption of our Redeemer, Jesus Christ. Okay, let's come back to Ruth. And as we do that, let me ask you a question, particularly if you've been with us, been working through it. As this story comes to a close, what would you expect? As we've been cheering for Ruth and Boaz and hoping that they might come together, and now all the obstacles are cleared out the way, what do you think these last few verses might be about? Well, surely aren't we going to get a description of the wedding? We're going to get taken through their honeymoon snaps. We're going to be told what their happily ever after was like. Surely that's what is to come. But actually, Ruth, she almost, and indeed Boaz, almost fades from view in these closing verses. And the book that bears Ruth's name, actually at the end, it barely mentions her. Because it's all about the baby. It's all about the baby. These closing verses, they put our, if I'm honest, what I think is a slightly over-the-top birth announcement industry in the shade. There's much more going on here than those big balloons you pop for the gender reveal and the big lavish Facebook announcements. Because actually, even before they get married, all the town's elders can speak of are their offspring. The offspring that will come from Ruth and Boaz's union. Have a look halfway through verse 11. We are witnesses. And then they say, may the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the family of Israel. May you have standing in Epaphra and be famous in Bethlehem. Through the offspring the Lord gives you by this young woman. May your family be like that of Perez, who Tamar bore to Judah. If you know the story of God's old people in the Old Testament, you might remember that from Rachel and Leah came the 12 tribes of Israel. They were like the founding mothers of the nation. And then from an elderly Judah and the young widowed Tamar came the line of Perez, who incidentally, as we see at the end of the chapter, was one of Boaz's ancestors. You're going to be, these elders say, like a new, new dynasty among God's people. That's what you're going to bring about. And you're going to be the father and the mother of someone who, actually like you, Boaz, will show God's loving kindness to people in a completely off the scale way. They're extraordinary blessings to give to this childless Moabite widow. Someone who's from outside of God's people, who in 10 years of her marriage to Mahlon never conceived. I was trying to think what it might be like, and here's what I got to. It would be like going to Leicester City's training ground in their pre-season in 2015 and telling them in 9 months' time they'd be lifting the Premier League trophy high. They would have said you were completely nuts, off your rocker. That doesn't happen to teams like us, they would have said. And yet 9 months later, there they were, lofting the trophy high. And to this old man and to this young widow who hadn't borne a child in her previous marriage, what happens? A child is given. Verse 13. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And when he made love to her, the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. And then what do you make of how this son is spoken of in verse 14, where the focus goes? Verse 14, the women said to Naomi, praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will relieve your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and is better to you than 7 sons, has given him birth. Then Naomi took the child in her arms and cared for him. The woman living there said, Naomi has a son. Naomi has a son. And they named him Obed. Not for the last time, God comes to the aid of his people through the birth of an unexpected child. Because for Naomi, this child, this son of Ruth's, becomes, did you see what it was described in the middle of verse 14? He was described as a guardian redeemer, one who will ensure the continuation of her family line. And because of that, verse 15, he will renew your life, give you hope for the future. And also, verse 15, by providing for her, he will sustain her into old age. This surprise baby boy is Naomi's means of redemption. And you can tell, can't you? She is absolutely delighted. She's thrilled as she holds this baby in her arms. Here's one who's going to be for her that guardian redeemer. Now, of course, she's joyful, but she does have to wait to fully enjoy that redemption that Obed will bring. After all, a newborn baby, he's no good in the field at the moment. He's not going to be planting the barley or harvesting it. But that sort of promise of future redemption brings joy to Naomi's heart. And in fact, it wasn't just Naomi who Obed was good news for, because end of verse 17, Obed was the father of Jesse, the father of David. And of course, we know who David was, don't we? We know that he was the king after God's own heart. And so this story, which began in the days of the judges, when Israel had no king and everyone did as they saw fit, ends with the king God will use to transform Israel, who's sort of the zenith, the high point of the history of God's people in the Old Testament. What a transformation from a time when Israel had no king, when everyone did as they saw fit, to a time when there was a godly king in place who showed the people, who inspired the people to live God's way. But of course, as good as David was, we know, don't we, that there were times when actually he did as he saw fit. Times when he didn't honour the Lord, who didn't show his people what it was like to live God's way. In fact, he showed them the complete opposite of that. And so much later, thousands of years later, when we read of a child unexpectedly being born to a virgin, a child who is also in the family line of Perez, who's a descendant of David, well, our ears, they prick up. And then when Zechariah, his uncle, prophesies about his birth in these words, where we can start to get excited. What does he say? Zechariah prophesies, "Praise be to the Lord, the God of Israel, because he has come to his people and redeemed them." And then when after the prophetess Anna meets Mary and Joseph and the baby Jesus in the temple, what does she do? She spoke about the child to all who were looking forward to the redemption of Jerusalem. And we long to lean in and listen to what it was that Anna was saying. Because like Naomi, our redemption comes through the birth of an unexpected child. Even if, like Naomi, we too have to wait to a future day when we can fully enjoy all that his redemption will bring as we enjoy the blessings of the new creation. But even though that blessing is in the future, it doesn't stop us rejoicing in the present with Naomi, with Zechariah, with Anna. Because knowing that our full redemption will happen, it's certain, because Jesus has paid the price, means that we can celebrate in the present. And isn't Christmas a wonderful gift to be able to do that? We can celebrate in the present because of that future redemption, and we can also trust, like Naomi did, that actually that promise of future redemption will renew our lives in the present, bringing fullness from emptiness. That transition Naomi knew, from coming back saying, Don't call me Naomi. Call me Mara. Call me bitter. For the Lord has brought me back empty. From that to the fullness of having this child in her arms. And of course, this Redeemer, this guardian Redeemer of ours, will not only sustain us in our old age, but into eternal life. See, like Naomi, our redemption comes through the birth of an unexpected child, even if we have to wait to enjoy the blessings of that redemption fully.